that.
Our eyes were greeted by the cold and dusty surface of the moon, studded with craters and strewn with regolith rocks. The moon was much larger than I had envisioned. I was strapping on my spacesuit when a disturbing feeling hit me. I don't feel too well, Tom, I let out in confusion. Same here, Liam, Tom added. You feel the same way too? I asked curiously. Yeah, I have this pain in my head, Tom replied. It's probably nothing. I was ready to take my first step on the moon. We had practiced dozens of simulation missions on the moon for years, and we had dreamt of this moment ever since. Our mission was simple: explore the lunar surface for anything strange and collect data and soil samples in just 1 hour. But we had filled our tanks with enough oxygen to last us 30 more minutes. The surface of the moon was nothing like back on Earth. It was lacking any evidence of life, and it was void of oxygen and atmosphere. It had lots of fine, talcum powder-like dust mixed with a complete variety of pebbles, rocks, and boulders, but it was still a delightful sight. It smells like gunpowder, Tom chuckled. The awkward pain in my head grew every second, but I tried to convince myself that it was nothing to worry about. I was standing above the moon, and that seemed to be the most important thing at the moment. 90 minutes. Tom, you ready? I said with excitement, and Tom nodded in agreement. I knew I was born for this moment. I could hear the whispers of fulfillment in my head, and not even a headache would stop me. Is your timer ready? I'd asked one last time, and Tom nodded in confirmation. We jumped off the lunar module and turned on the timer. Our first steps on the moon were quite rocky as we fought to regain balance and get used to the moon's gravity. The pain in my head was slowly becoming unbearable, and I began to wonder what was causing it. I noticed that Tom was also uncomfortable. Have we done something wrong? I thought to myself, but no. We had heeded to all the necessary precautions. Are you alright, Tom? Not really, Tom replied. I feel like I hit my head on a rock. This was not the experience we had hoped for, but we had to brave through it. We strolled away from our lunar module spacecraft. I was curious to explore everything I saw. We had to keep watch at our timers though, so that we would not get too far past our time. Moonwalking was the most intensive task, yet fun part of our short lunar adventure. We feel like an oxymoron of both light and heavy at the same time. Gravity is such a beautiful concept, I thought. Tom was holding up so far, which was a good sign, although he seemed to be feeling the brunt of the pain more than I was. We collected some samples and were already preparing to return to our lunar module. We were both exhausted, and the pain in my head had spread to other parts of my body. We knew we had to return immediately if we didn't want to pay a heavy price. My vision was slowly becoming blurred, been contaminated by a space virus, I thought. Several thoughts ran through my head as we made our way back towards our lunar module spacecraft. Where is the spaceship? I was certain that this was the spot. I stared at the gray lunar surface, and I could see where our footsteps had begun. My first step was on the lunar surface of the moon, but our spaceship was gone without a trace. Tom fell to the floor. Tom! What's wrong? He had been breathing heavily for a while, and I just wanted to get back into the space module, but now, the entire spacecraft was gone without a trace. I can't breathe, Tom whispered. I stared at my timer. But it's just been about 70 minutes. We still have almost 20 minutes left. My heart began to race, and I stared in confusion as Tom groaned under his spacesuit. My vision began to blur, and once again the pain in my head had doubled. What is going on? I mused. Everything didn't seem logical anymore. The painful headaches, the blurry vision, and now our missing transport. I dropped to the floor as I occasionally took glances at my timer. What was I going to do about Tom? I couldn't even take off his space helmet as I watched him struggle to stay alive. An explosion erupted behind me as my heart skipped a beat. I stood abruptly and shifted my gaze towards the direction of the sound. A thick mist had enveloped the site of the explosion. My sight was still blurry, but I could see something move in the distance. My deepest fears were finally becoming a reality. I'd always feared that something was going to happen during the trip. I dragged Tom to a spot behind a small moon rock as something approached from the distance. I took a closer look at the footsteps in front of me and realized that they weren't ours. "What the?" I exclaimed as my heart pounded loudly. Running was not a good idea, as gravity was against us and Tom had passed out. He was still breathing, and I hope he stayed that way. I took a glance at my timer once again. I had just 5 minutes to get back into the lunar module before I ran out of oxygen. What could have taken something as huge as our spacecraft without any noise or signs? I became so lost in thoughts that I forgot that I'd seen something move in the mist earlier. I heaved a heavy sigh and jerked my head up to see what had moved in the mist. Nothing. Everything had returned to exactly how it was earlier. No explosions, no mist, and no movements. Am I going crazy? I asked myself as I returned my gaze to the alien footprints. They still looked that way. I heard another bang at a distance and immediately shifted my gaze in that direction. I could spot what seemed like our spacecraft in the distance. Maybe I was wrong about where we'd stepped down anyway. A ray of hope burst through my entire being as I immediately grabbed Tom and hopped towards the direction of the spacecraft. I stared at my timer once again, and it read 3 minutes. I had been hopping into space over the moon for about a minute when I noticed that the spacecraft was not getting any closer. I set Tom down. Fear blanketed my face once again as I stood alone on the entire moon in confusion. What was meant to be an adventurous space trip to the moon suddenly took a sharp turn into a terrifying race for survival. The strange mist soon began to form again around me. I was almost convinced that I had lost my mind. I stared at Tom. "Tom? Tom! Tom!" I screamed in dread, but my voice was shielded by my spacesuit. Tom was gone without a trace. I stared at my timer. 1 minute. All of a sudden, a foul creature grabbed me from behind, tackling me towards the lunar surface and throwing several punches at my helmet. There was something familiar about the alien. I had surely seen it before, but I wondered how. One of its punches made a small crack on my helmet. I had to do something. I immediately buried my knee towards its groin region and propelled it into space with my feet. It seemed to float in space. Suddenly, I remembered where I'd seen the alien. It was a movie back on Earth. My scariest movie. I finally guessed what had been going on all night. "Tom, stop!" I screamed, but he was probably seeing me too as some sort of extraterrestrial life form. And it took a second before he came to a halt. The mist had settled and we both stood facing each other. He dashed towards me again, throwing his arms forward. I knew it was Tom, so I had to be cautious. I dodged his blow and grabbed him from his back, ripping out one of his oxygen pipes by mistake. As the gas sipped out, my fears were confirmed. We had not been breathing in oxygen since we stepped out of the ship. My timer began to beep. Tom was out of oxygen and fell to the ground unconscious. I shut my eyes and prayed underneath my breath. At least we are going to be recorded in history as the astronauts who never made it back. The 2 astronauts who died on the moon. I could already imagine the many captions on several magazines trying to describe how we died. I opened my eyes once more, and our lunar module stood right in front of me. I couldn't believe my eyes. What is going on? I thought. I shut my eyes and opened them again after a while. The module was gone. I repeated the process, and the lunar module had reappeared. I stared at my timer. It had run down to the very last second. I was out of oxygen too. I kept my eyes wide open, grabbed Tom and carried him towards the module. I had also run out of oxygen, but this was our last shot at survival. And if I missed it, then our stories would be told by someone else. I leaped towards the lunar space module as fast as I could. I didn't have any oxygen left and I couldn't even blink, but I kept my mind and my gaze fixed on the goal as I soared forward. I reached the spacecraft, rushed in, and shut the door behind me as we both fell to the ground. Oxygen had never felt so good. I proceeded to take off my spacesuit and toss it on the ground as I tried to wrap my head around what had just happened as the headache began to lift off. Everything still seemed to swirl around us in a distorted manner. I finally shut my eyes and reopened them again, but nothing seemed to disappear anymore. We had both been hallucinating all along. Just then, a thought crashed into my mind as I immediately sprung up and rushed for the oxygen tank. I read the label on the tank. It read, HLN oxygen. Caution. causes intense hallucinations. The hallucinating gas we use back on Earth at the space hub for research purposes. But its cylinder looks so much like normal oxygen. Tom had asked me to separate it from the normal oxygen before our mission, but it somehow skipped my mind. We have been hallucinating ever since we put on our spacesuit. I shifted my gaze towards Tom and knelt beside him. He was still breathing. "You'll be fine, buddy," I mused, as I marched forward to prepare for liftoff.